Welcome. I'm Margaret Scott, and I'm delighted that you all could join us. I'm with the New York Southeast Asia Network, and it's very exciting that we've got such a large audience from all over the region, and I hope you all will think about joining our newsletter. We have many events coming up, and one that may be of interest is on July 29th on the Philippines. We're going to be doing a webinar on This is How Democracy Dies. The COVID pandemic has pushed us to Zoom, and that's a good thing because it's opened us up to people in Southeast Asia. But COVID is also accelerating many dark trends that our two speakers tonight have been investigating for quite a while. And their dark trends that they know about are only getting worse because with COVID, the digital world has become actually even more urgent and ever present. We are joined tonight and very, very grateful that they could join us with, by Jonathan Ong, who's an associate professor of global digital media at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Ross Tapsell, who's a senior lecturer and researcher on Southeast Asian media at the Australian National University. The two of them have done some original and important research and published a report that I urge you all to read. And what we are going to be, we hope, probing and unraveling tonight is some of the implications of a lot of what they know so deeply, trends that are only getting more embedded and accelerating. And that is that Southeast Asia has become the laboratory of innovations in social media and innovations in disinformation and innovations in how the state is using the worry about fake news and COVID to, sadly, instead of being a place that people can turn to help with disinformation, has become a bad actor, which is actually making the waters very muddy and more silence of dissent and more clampdown on free expression. Of course, there's some bright spots, but that's the overall bad picture, sadly. And our speakers worry that some of these bad trends are going to be cascading through the region and perhaps show us what the rest of the world may be facing down the pike. So without further ado, I just want to very briefly say that Jonathan is going to be talking about Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines, all of these countries have a very different history. All of them are facing different challenges. All of them are engaging in different crises. And Jonathan will start us off with kind of an overview, and then we're going to turn to Ross, who's going to pay some attention to Malaysia and Indonesia. And then I'm hoping we'll open it up to some conversation, and then we're going to get to your Q&As. There's a lot of you here, so we look forward to your Q&As. And just to tell you that on the bottom, there is a Q&A. You all know Zoom. Just write your questions out, and I will try to get to all of them. So without further ado, thank you so much, both of you. And over to you, Jonathan.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks also for everyone who's joining across different time zones. Disinformation is such an urgent issue in Southeast Asia. In some contexts, it's even a matter of life and death. And so I think it's important to have a very responsible discussion around it and think about ways we can muster very responsible regulation and interventions to address it. So when I talk to my colleagues who are in the disinformation space across different disciplines, I'm a comm scholar, and I always would say that it's important for you guys to look at Southeast Asia because the platforms here, the disinformation innovations and techniques of media manipulation will preview what is to come in your other countries, in other regions, and also, sadly, as Margaret has pointed out, disinformation regulations in Southeast Asia often have like very bad examples, and there's potential snowball effects, right, of these kinds of legal mechanisms to regulate the information ecosystem. So here we have many examples where the so-called cures to disinformation are often worse than the disease itself. And I think it's important for us to spotlight those. So just to set the stage quite quickly, Southeast Asia is a very diverse region with intense social media activity. So the top, so three countries in Southeast Asia always rank among the top five most active social media users around the world. So Hootsuite surveys will rank the Philippines, Indonesia, and Thailand as always among the users who spend the longest in social media. And it's not just Facebook, although many are on Facebook, and Facebook is the internet for many in the region. But platforms such as Line are very important to talk about. They're not often discussed. So Line is super popular in Thailand. In the Philippines, Viber is very popular. They're not often discussed in the global debates around fake news. And we have to mention also Indonesia as the Instagram click farm capital of the world. So they often would be selling fake followers to clients overseas. And that's really worrying, right? And so these countries embrace social media, not often and not solely just for politics. It's more of a recent thing, right? Like think about how social media were embraced for family communication, romantic connections, but also ways in which fan expression and mobilization happen. Think about transnational fan communities for Korean pop culture, also beauty pageants, which are super popular in the region. And eventually, as more older people gravitated to social media, they became repurposed for politics. So in our most recent report, which is now in the chat box, we identified several Southeast Asian innovations, and I'll just highlight a couple of them for us to discuss and think about their global implications. So first, on the Philippines and the 2019 election campaign innovations in the Philippines, which later we saw in the US Democrat primaries, was the use of micro-influencers for politics, for political campaigns. So micro-influencers are those online celebrities with not like the highest number of followings, right? So mega influencers are different. These are the well-known celebrities who command millions of followers on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. But micro-influencers are popular among niche communities. And what's the implication of that? They're harder to spot, they're harder to identify, and they're not always sharing clearly disinformative material, but they're being paid by politicians, and the kind of disclosure mechanisms around this practice are not very transparent. Certainly, influencers should be regulated differently if they're doing this for politicians rather than for corporate brands. So this became a huge issue in the US when Mike Bloomberg, the failed Democrat candidate, used hundreds of meme pages, micro-influencer accounts across Facebook and Instagram. And that triggered some discussion about influencer marketing for politics. I think we need to be discussing this more in Southeast Asia. Influencer marketing is so big as an industry in Singapore, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Another Southeast Asian innovation I just want to quickly highlight is the use of Instagram for politics, and Indonesia is leading here. So in the lead up to their 2019 elections, Instagram was used by influencers for parody, for political campaigns, and that has broader implications for the fact check industry, right? Fact checkers and journalists are trained to fact check false claims and false speech. But Instagram is a visual platform, and that's harder, more laborious to fact check. What other kinds of mechanisms of fighting fake news should be marshaled when visuals blur the lines between false, true, misleading, when it's like a Photoshop image, or the image is true but the caption is misleading, right? So that's important to think about. one other case, Margaret didn't mention this, but I feel that obliged to mention the Myanmar case, as it's the clearest example of a platform, in this case Facebook, enabling the spread of hate speech targeting ethnic minorities. And this has been found by the UN as violating hate speech laws that clearly lead to incitement to violence. And that triggers another important discussion for regulation, because here the commander-in-chief and military officials were found responsible, and therefore Facebook deplatformed these high-level officials, right? So the kind of discussion around this is just starting to be talked about in the US context, right? So far, it's only just influencers that have been deplatformed of YouTube. But what about like political leaders? So I'll finally discuss what about the innovations when it comes to regulation. And here, the Singapore case holds in a way, as the scariest example, because they're known as the country with the most powerful and overreaching new anti-fake news law, which they call the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation, or POFMA in short. So it gives the government powers to decide over content banning and user takedowns. And for the scholar Cherian George, he reviews this as the government demonstrating legislative opportunism, where, this law is not needed, it's overreaching. It's where the ruling party fans the flames of moral panics of fake news in order to gain more control over over political speech and targeting dissenters. So we've seen how this kind of fake news law is very much present in some of the kinds of mechanisms and legal instruments that different governments are taking. So the Philippines has shoehorned provisions targeting fake news in relation to COVID. And there's been like a school teacher in some small town and her son who faced criminal prosecution for allegedly posting disinformative material. And these are like low-level targets that, there's clearly arbitrary applications of this kind of provision. So I'd like to ask Margaret and Ross, really also ask scholars who work on this about for me, the most urgent questions that the region would raise. One is about regulation and what is the right approach to lobby for more and better regulation in Southeast Asia. So as a scholar who has worked with election commissions in the Philippines, with journalists, with lawmakers in the Philippines, and also industry professionals in advertising and public relations, when I say that we need more regulation for transparency and accountability of campaigns, it's as if regulation is a bad word. And I think that's a legitimate fear, because in Southeast Asia, it's often the state which is the worst bad actor compared to the disinformation producer. But certainly we need to find new ways to think about how to regulate the social media ecosystem as a public sphere, right? That sustains democratic discourse. And one other question that I have for everyone as well, I'd love to hear from you, because this is something that I'm grappling with, is about what are norms that should guide citizens' interventions in the fight against fake news? So here, I think about examples of how there's a kind of celebratory discourse in terms of how, for example, Thailand and Taiwan Milk Tea Alliance tried to challenge the trolls of the Communist Party in China. In the Philippines, we've got attempts also to name and shame bloggers and trolls which are associated to Duterte. And for me, this is a question of, are these organic expressions of active citizenship, or could they also be guilty of violating the same social media community standards of authenticity? And what worries me is that might these new practices signal or lead the idea in terms of how engaged citizens might become the enemy that they vow to fight against. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Lots of food for thought. And there's so many themes and avenues that I hope we can pursue. And Ross, pick up from where Jonathan took off, and then we'll try to figure out a way to get you engaged in a conversation with each other about some of these before we turn it over to Q&A. Thanks, Ross.
Yes, thanks to you both, and thanks for everyone for tuning in on a Friday night or Saturday morning, wherever you may be. Just to pick up on a couple of points that John just raised there. The first the primary finding, I guess, the first finding in the report was the way in which incumbents make use of the state's information machinery. And so we've seen this in a number of countries, and you might automatically come to mind to think of Duterte's troll army, or in Indonesia, it might be the state-sponsored buzzers, or in Malaysia, Malaysia's cyber troopers. So everyone has a different term usually in the country, but you could look at this in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, where we are seeing the state becoming, or has become for some time, the primary bad actor. And so how do we envisage that, and then how do we regulate it? And to think about how they become bad actors is important, and often it's around driving controversy through buzzers or cyber troopers or trolls to polarize society and polarize opinions around identity politics issues, or post-truth is another term that's been popularized for some time, and to create imaginary threats to the nation or to religious groups or primary religions. And so we've seen that with Duterte and the drug war, and the idea that the Philippines is a narco state, and therefore is a threat to the nation state. We've seen it in Myanmar with this disinformation campaign against the Rohingya. But of course, communism still drives a lot of this disinformation campaign in Malaysia and Indonesia. Whether it's this, Jokowi is a communist initially, the current president, to more broadly, certain parliamentary bills are being driven by communist agendas, which we've seen in the past month in Indonesia. And this general idea that Islam is being undermined is a common theme of disinformation campaigners. Or in Malaysia, the idea that the certain political parties like the DAP might be the communists, or this idea of a bogey person. So we do see a lot of the information machinery be state driven, and so how do we regulate this without the state being the key regulatory actor, if that makes sense to everyone there? So if the state's driving it, well, the state's probably not the solution. And so, well, what is the solution? And you could argue this around tech platforms as well. If tech platforms and, a bunch of white guys in the Silicon Valley who created Facebook and Twitter and so on, maybe a bunch of tech savvy white guys in Silicon Valley are not the solution either. So yeah, how do we come up with the best regulatory model, and who gets the most agency, or who should drive this? When it comes to regulation. So that's a question that we could discuss and follow up. The second point which John raised, and probably the most controversial finding in the report, if I may say so, is this idea that disinformation production has become democratized. And this is quite controversial. This is in many ways, it should be debated, because it sounds like an oxymoron, right? How can disinformation become democratized? Aren't the two clearly apart from each other? And so what do we mean by this, and why is it contentious? And I guess what we're trying to say from our report and our study, and in particular looking at the Philippines case of 2019, the most recent election, but also in Indonesia, is that it's now become common practice for almost all political parties to have a strong social media campaign as part of their funds, as part of their campaign funds, and that therefore that leads to more ability for these campaigners, or more tendency for these campaigners to create what is called black campaigning, or fervent negative campaigning, or disinformation campaigning. And that we've seen this at lower local levels as well, like at barangay captain type elections, local mayor elections in Indonesia and the Philippines. And so what we're saying here is that while the state remains to be the primary bad actor, this practice is spreading. And it's spreading at local levels. It's spreading, you know, outside of capital cities. We often just think of, you know, the Jakarta election, or you know, Manila, KL being the central place for these bad actors. But we're now seeing, you know, even locally engaged, you know, sole trader entrepreneurs being hired at local levels to just, you know, be part of a social media campaign, which can lead to disinformation production. So this is contentious because people do like to think that we need to highlight the primary bad actors only, because they're the, you know, like I said, the cyber troopers, the buzzers. But we're also trying to say, well, yeah, we got to be careful that if people are now saying, when you talk to any political campaigner and they say, I've got to have a social media team, I've got to have a team of buzzers, or I've got to have a team of cyber troopers, because I got to counter these primary bad actors. What kind of political discourse are we creating for the future? And so, yeah, how do we try to portray this in a way that is helpful to have a better political system and to have a better election campaign discourse? And that's a challenge for us. And I'd be interested in what people think. So I might turn back to Margaret and hear if she'd like to raise some questions from those opening remarks, and then we can get into a discussion.
I'm hoping that all you participants are thinking and throwing some questions in the hopper, because this arc of what both Jonathan and Ross have laid out is actually pretty dismal. So there's first the arc of social media itself. Rappler, for instance, started as an arm of Facebook. It was married to Facebook, and that was in the days when social media and the internet were going to be, you know, our salvation and democratization of ideas, and very hopeful, almost utopian. Now we've got Facebook as inciting violence in Myanmar, along with many other sins. So that arc of what social media platforms have become. Then there's the second one, which is everybody has gone lower, democratization of disinformation. That's a really tough one. How do you regulate citizens, political actors, people who use social media to prevent everybody going to the most black campaign, meaning it becomes mainstream? That's a different arc. Then there's the state. And I would love the two of you to, if we could just start with the state, and if both of you would lay out what these countries in Southeast Asia have been doing, which is sort of innovative, to use fake news to create new laws. And Jonathan, you know, in particular, both Thailand and the Philippines have been forefront in this, and it's continuing. And tell us about that, and then what it means for the relationship between the legal regime and social media.
Sure. So to me, I think, so Thailand had their elections last year, and it was so instructive for me to visit and interview campaigners, activists, other academics. And in a way, Thailand has a much deeper history of polarization than other Southeast Asian countries. So that's how they describe their political system, as one of deep polarization. So in a way, they're kind of further down the line compared to the rest of the other countries, including the US, right? We're talking about irreconcilable differences and like the hollowing out of the middle. So in Thailand, it's not just political parties which are split. Even academics and academic discourse is politically polarized. So a quite literal politics of citation. You only cite people with a party that you believe in and that you ally with. And so for them, the discussion is rather different. So for them, it's like, it's always going to be unfair. The state will always be targeting the opposition first. This is what activists will say. And all they ask and all they've been trying to lobby for is a much fairer playing field. But they always recognize that the battleground in politics is now super uneven, and they will be resurrecting older kind of a libel and also libel laws, cybercrime provisions, also around critique of the monarchy, as ways to kind of silence the opposition, even disqualify political parties and candidates, and even curb particular kinds of campaign tactics. So one thing that I think that Thailand did, which I worry that the Philippines and other countries might copy, is that the election commission became quite partisan, and they curb this potential a popular a new movement which is trying to mobilize the grassroots. And suddenly during the election cycle, they prohibited any kind of grassroots campaigns. Recognizing that the masses might be gravitating more to this party. So there's some elements of that, like using kind of older laws, stretching them to their limits to quell political dissent. And then the other tactic is introduce all new ones, which is a Malaysian example, which Ross should talk about more, and the Singapore example, which is very worrying, and global scholars are actually thinking of that as having real chilling effects and like a real bad example.
Yeah, although interestingly,
Ross?
John, in our chats in the Philippines, you know, people just didn't want the Singapore model, right? So, and I think initially in Malaysia under the previous government, there was this idea that the POFMA law was a bad thing that other countries didn't want to emulate. So in a way that's positive, right? In that people can look at Singapore and say, no, this is clearly going to be used to, you know, for politicization. So in a way that's kind of a positive sign.
So there's actually a fake news law kind of modeled after POFMA that has gone around the Philippine Senate for a while. And the lawmakers we've met were very critical of this. This is not the model that we wish to adopt. But you see its influence in some of the justifications around the Bayanihan Act and the ways in which fake news provisions were shoehorned in there. And of course, the anti-terror bill, which was recently passed. So it's not going to be a copy-paste of the POFMA as an all-new regulation, but there's a way in which certain passages of it are also copied in other kinds of acts. And here, COVID is used, right, as a kind of shock moment to justify this introduction.
Yeah, and COVID will be another example where, as one cannot campaign normally, the political parties or election can normally be held where you can have big mass rallies and, you know, distribute goods and funds and sembako and these kind of things, rice and even money politics. That social media campaigning will be far more important during COVID. So elections this year and presumably for parts of next year, unless there's a vaccine, we're going to see, I presume, more money being funneled into social media campaigning, because that's just allows for important reach into homes that when one can't campaign normally.
Yeah, and
Sorry,
even
Margaret.
Singapore, which had their most which is the country with the most recent elections, right, that just concluded, saw a lot of pivoting to digital campaigns, and there's a lot of accounts. And Singapore is quite uh, so many have pointed out how super partisan the discourse became, and even those who are anti PAP were criticizing how some kinds of techniques were kind of becoming a bit more extreme, and we need and people are behaving like bullies within among the opposition party. So that's worrying, that even Singapore has, that kind of online civility, right? It's kind of that practice when it comes to campaigns has become dirtier.
Yeah, but in a way, you could also say, and the results suggest that with 61%, I think, of vote to the PAP, which is considered quite a remarkable result given the election structure and so on and the dominance of the PAP. But this is interesting in a Malaysia context for me, because during the 2018 Malaysia election campaign, we saw a number of techniques, perhaps, which were used, which was not necessarily a disinformation campaign, but social media was really important in usurping mainstream media and pro-government propaganda to be able to pump out narratives of corruption of the government, in that time, the Najib government. And so the narrative of Najib and his wife Rosma are corrupt, and the 1MDB scandal is real, and they've been stealing from the state, really resonated throughout areas of Malaysia when I was traveling through during the election. And so when I ask people in the field, so what do you think about the Prime Minister Najib? They would say, well, he's clearly corrupt. I say, well, how do you know that? And they say, oh, Facebook or WhatsApp. And so social media has been really important for opposition groups when the state can control the mainstream media, as would be the case in Singapore. So again, it's this challenge of the democratization of some of these techniques, and to what extent is it disinformation? To what extent should this be regulated? And it's a huge challenge, I think. Sorry, Margaret's been trying to get in, and we've been.
Well, no, am I on? I hate to add another layer of complexity, but journalism, because you've just mentioned that there are countries in Southeast Asia where it's state-controlled media, but there are other countries where there's a robust variety and pluralism of media. So journalism does have a connection to disinformation, often as fact-checking, which Jonathan knows a lot about in the Philippines. There's a huge civil society from the grassroots up trying to intervene and deal with disinformation. There's other places where that's not as successful. So what I'm trying to get at now is moving towards interventions. And when you talk about interventions, I wonder whether you could even mention whether journalism matters, because it is a dying phenomenon, unfortunately, all across the world, sadly. And secondly, whether when we can talk about, we've talked about the state, I want to start talking about the platforms, Facebook, YouTube, where are they in all of this? Because one of the most interesting, besides the polarization phenomenon, which is widespread throughout the region, your report shows that these platforms have been brilliant in deflecting accountability. And so I'd love for us to engage in that for a while, okay? And I'm gonna mute myself and you two go to it. And then we have some great questions. So after this round, I wanna go to
Ross, did you want to take the journalism and fact-checking bit? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And absolutely, categorically, journalism matters, and it's absolutely crucial during this time where as facts get distorted and as there is such a vast array of platforms and information and misinformation, disinformation getting shared, you need a reliable source that you trust, that you go to, that you can say, okay, these, you know, and that's in many ways why in Australia, when you look at recent surveys where I'm based, the ABC, the national broadcaster, has such a high trust levels. And I think you can relate some of this to some of the ways that we've handled the COVID situation. Definitely not perfect and concerning at the moment, growing, but the trust in a reliable public broadcaster has been really crucial in Australia to get people to rally behind, you know, government decisions and also to understand the facts of what's going on during the pandemic. So, I mean, if you think about, people often ask about democracy in Southeast Asia and, you know, what can governments do? What can, you know, what can Western, including America, what can Western governments do? But if you were to take Rappler out of the Philippines, Tempo out of Indonesia, Malaysia Kini out of Malaysia, and so on, you know, what would that mean for democracy? It would be disastrous. It would be categorically disastrous. So we need to prop up, especially during the digital era financially, and also against the threats against the state. We need to make sure that there is a reliable source that people can go to. And so, yeah, the fact checking is a different element. And honestly, I'm slightly skeptical of the role that fact checkers can play in the broader information society in the digital era. From my research in various semi-rural areas of Southeast Asia, you know, people aren't going to fact-checking sites. People are very much just consuming news and information via two sources. You know, Facebook and WhatsApp is pretty much about it in Indonesia and Malaysia. And so this idea that they're going to fact check a certain source which comes through from a friend on WhatsApp, which was sent by another friend, which talks about health misinformation or political misinformation, then they're going to check it on a fact checker site, isn't really happening. So quality journalism that is, you know, promoted, including sort of local radio quality journalism, which has been very important in the region, it is absolutely essential. Over to you, John.
Yeah, so just to add to fact checking and its opportunities and risks, right? So I totally agree that fact checking politicians and their false claims, their gaslighting, it has to happen, right? Like these are people that we should hold accountable. And the reach of the lies that they perpetuate will have much more far-reaching consequences than misinformation, low-level misinformation expressed by ordinary people or even an influencer. So that so there's so those are two different things, right? Like fact-checking the politician and fact-checking an ordinary person or a meme that you see online. Sadly, what we're seeing is that platforms such as Facebook have partnered with fact-check organizations, 3 in the Philippines, 5 in Indonesia, 1 in Thailand. And the incentives are perverse and wrong. Fact checkers in these countries get paid for fact checking ordinary people, but they don't get compensated if they fact check a politician, which is more important. So to me, like, I think these news organizations are able to strategically use some of the resources and in fact funnel them over to investigative journalism, which is much more important than fact checking like a meme that you saw shared online. Also, as we have seen in the case of COVID, a lot of a lot of disinformation happens within close groups and chat groups, which are beyond the purview of these fact checkers who are only able to see the newsfeed or only able to see public accounts, right? So that is my criticism. And number 2, even the kind of journalism and reporting around disinformation has to evolve. It has to evolve away from good versus evil kinds of binaries and narratives. It's important to fact check and to report on bad actors across the political spectrum and not just one political party. So, and this, as Ross has mentioned about the democratization of disinformation, and this makes academics like me disagree with some of our journalist allies who will, there's a trend towards a partisanship when in fact-checking. I think in India is the country where fact-check has become such an industry, and fact-checkers in themselves express a political alignment. They will say that I will only fact-check the other side. My question is it something that we want for the rest of the region? For me, it's important to fact check across the political spectrum and to report on bad actors across the spectrum. Because in the Philippines and other countries, including Thailand, they're not really ideologically differentiated, right? So it's not the same as the alt-right perpetuating kinds of misinformation, targeting ethnic minorities, amplifying xenophobic speech and discourse. In different countries in Southeast Asia, sometimes the kind of speech that happens here and the people behind them, they're really just in it for the money. And politicians are also very fluid in terms of their political alignment. They'll gravitate towards who's charismatic, who's popular for the moment. And therefore, we need to hold them accountable. We need to hold their speech accountable and the speech of their strategists accountable. So that to me is super important. I'd also love to acknowledge how human rights actors are also at the forefront of the fight against disinformation, and they're heavily targeted in the disinformation ecosystem, trying to undermine human rights principles. And one thing that I found in my most recent research is that as a coping mechanism, Margaret, they have just withdrawn from the, some of them would choose to be in the front lines while others choose to do back channeling and go to the grassroots to avoid being targets of the state, right? And of course, they could face trumped up criminal charges if they stand in the front lines. And so for me, that's where disinformation becomes even, again, more important, because disinformation producers and politicians get to control the narrative. If the people who are fighting against the state and bad actors withdraw completely from the public sphere.
So how, there's quite a few questions of asking for bright lights or things that are working. If you both feel as though disinformation has been democratized, how to transcend that, how to get back to where truth-telling has value, where fact-checking is believed, where people who have truth on their agenda are incentivized. Is there a way that you can imagine to do that? One question is, do you think that digital media literacy is a useful and effective weapon? And this is, again, I'm throwing a lot out at you. I still want you guys to talk about the platforms, because we're asking for points of transcendence, points of light. What about the platforms and all of that? So, and then I'm going to wrap up some more questions too. But Ross or Jonathan, who wants to go first with what I just bundled together?
Yeah, first point on the platform. So I'm a strong believer that the platform takedowns and the naming and shaming of bad actors is a good practice. And I think that unfortunately, when a lot of these high level, organizations, PR companies linked to the state or linked to political parties, when they're exposed, it's usually by independent researchers. And we've seen this in Indonesia with the case of a group, vaguely linked to the previous vice president. We've seen this in the Philippines prior to the 2019 election. Rappler has exposed some of these actors. And then later on, Facebook might take them down. But we've spoken to some of these people who have been involved in that industry, who've had their material taken down by Facebook or by Twitter, and it hurts. They've spent, in some cases, years putting up this infrastructure, building these Facebook pages, and getting likes, getting followers, getting real organic followers on these Facebook pages. So when Facebook takes it down, it's like a year or two of their work that suddenly is not able to be accessed, or the access is reduced. So platform takedowns, I think, are a good thing. And I think if it's in the notion of transparency, that naming and shaming companies or individuals who are creating what Facebook likes to call inauthentic behavior, then that's a good thing. But why is it always or often that it's independent researchers or taxpayer funded researchers who are the ones who, or even journalists who are the ones that are exposing some of these bad actors? What do you think on that, John?
Yeah, what we saw in elections last year was that social media platforms were doing a lot of these takedowns of coordinated inauthentic behavior across multiple countries. And there's some which are highly publicized, and there's some which are having just less publicity. And I would assign some level of strategy and strategic thinking in terms of how they make those decisions. So I would acknowledge that, yeah, like full transparency is like such a big ask when it comes to those takedowns. Like, why only that set of accounts belonging to this person? Why not the other side? So it doesn't always have to be like fully transparent. I also think that those social media platforms with local offices and local public policy officers tend to have much more strategic thinking and alliances with different kinds of local researchers, also journalists and fact checkers, and they're able to do much more. So there's a level of great responsibility and ingenuity on the part of individual workers of these platforms too. So in the case of the Philippines, I know that they were able to do some flagging of hate speech around anti-China hate speech, recently becoming more normalized in COVID-19, in the wake of COVID-19. And Facebook introduced much stronger and easier protocols to report this kind of racist slurs targeting Chinese workers, Chinese ordinary people. So I think they are doing something good.
How to increase the leverage? I mean, sorry, there's a part of me that looks at Facebook paying Rappler or other journalists to help them monitor as a really unequal situation and sort of to me repulsive, actually. So what's the leverage for countries in Southeast Asia to demand more? I mean, Myanmar was shamed by the United Nations, but so they still don't have very many speakers of local languages that they've hired. What is the leverage to make these platforms more accountable?
Sadly, it's money that talks, as we have seen in how Facebook quite quickly changed their regulation around political advertising and the fact-checking of political claims and political speech from high-level government officials. That was predicated by a corporate ad ban and threats around that. So, and I think there's some level of cautious optimism on the part of academics with regard to that, because we cannot yield decision-making and the creation or the establishment of norms of our social media to private corporations, right? Like, we can't just sway with what's current or what they're trying to advance for a particular moment. It has to be grounded on particular principles. And for me, it's around transparency and accountability. So yeah, I hate to think about, to be quite pessimistic about it, but that's one issue which we should be cautiously optimistic about and not purely celebratory about, which I've seen some people do actually.
But how do you get accountability and transparency? Ross, what are your thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on your point about leverage. And I guess that the challenge in the Southeast Asian context is that when we talk about leverage over social media platforms, often it's the state that is trying to put the most pressure on social media platforms to collaborate or to conform to the norms in which pleases the state. And if you look at, say, I think Dien Nguyen's work in Vietnam, which is written in the New York Times and elsewhere, is fascinating to look at Facebook's what he describes as sort of acquiescing to requests from the Vietnamese government. So leverage is a tricky one, and in many ways we are concerned as the state grows in the disinformation space and they crack down more through various laws, that the balance is moving more towards state power, and platforms are being pressured to operate in a way which pleases the state. And so there's a number of really interesting cases we could get into on that. I'm conscious of time if there's more you wanted to get to.
Yeah, I just wanted to add about the Facebook Oversight Board, which to me is a step in the right direction. So the Facebook Oversight Board is supposed to act as kind of like a Supreme Court for social media content. And it's composed of a diverse, or not so diverse, group of mostly North American representatives, including human rights actors, journalists. There's one Southeast Asia representative, and he's an Indonesian journalist. Correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret, and you know how to pronounce his name. So
Andy Bayuni.
Yes.
Andy Bayuni, was former editor of the Jakarta Post, longtime journalist.
So for those of you who are less familiar, what this board does is Facebook has the option to consult the board when it comes to controversial content takedown issues. So they have responsibility over reviewing Facebook's decision to keep some content on or off. And this has been criticized by the legal scholar Jenny Domino as actually having very narrow remit, right? Like it's about content takedown. So it's not about user behavior. It's not about like taking into account advertising policy, for example, or political or influencer marketing practices. So Facebook has the option to consult them, but their function remains recommendatory. They have not yet started in their role. They start in September, and I think it's a kind of a wait and see attitude right now among academics working in this area. So again, some cautious optimism around what this board can contribute.
Thank you for that. And we have to reconvene to discuss this board. So I have two, I've been trying to bundle people's questions, but I have two more that I want to add. We don't have much time. Ross, you were asked, what do you think about disinformation in Islamic media, in the digital Islamic media in Indonesia? Is it ideological? Is it driven by market forces? That's one. And for both of you, and Jonathan, if you have something you want to say about ideological or market-driven disinformation, what's more important in general? And secondly, one of our audience wants to know what you expect as new innovations as we're looking forward to elections in the future. The question was in particular about the next Philippines election, but I'd love to broaden it. What kinds of new innovations do you anticipate? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I think the issue of Islam and polarization is a really important one, really interesting one being discussed. And some of my colleagues at ANU and elsewhere, such as Ed Aspinall and Eve Warburton, are looking at Indonesia and polarization. And so to what extent is this polarization happening and real? And to what extent is this a serious debate about the Indonesian state and the role of Islam in the Indonesian state? And so there's some wonderful research coming out from their studies, which are basically showing that when you break this down, yes, there is a really big distinction between voters who would like to see a greater role that Islam plays in Indonesian state and society, or in particular, the way in which the Indonesian state and laws operate. and a large section of Indonesian society, and this can be divided along geographical lines as well between Western and Eastern Indonesia, who want less or who want to have religion separate from the state. And so they're often described as the pluralists and so on. So my research here is to think about to what extent does social media just, in a way, it's like a windsock. It just blows with the prevailing breeze of a genuinely polarized election in a polarized country. Or to what extent are bad actors driving these discourses or attacks in some cases on social media, which ultimately leads to a more polarized society. And so in the last election in Indonesia, 2019, of course, we had the Prabowo camp and the Jokowi camp, and there was this debate around a polarized electorate. And then yet when the government is formed, Prabowo is part of the government. He's now the defense minister. There's this broad rainbow coalition as part of the government, which suggests that a lot of this so-called polarization that they campaigned about, and particularly around the role of Islam, is actually just done for an election campaign purpose. That's not to say that the role of Islam in election doesn't matter to voters, but how much of it was driven by political agendas, I think, is really interesting. In the new innovation space, yeah, I mean, it's always fascinating to research in this field. What makes it so fun in many ways, in that, you know, just when you've got your head around the way that, you know, cyber troopers might dominate an election in Malaysia, suddenly it's all about big data campaigning, and, you know, suddenly international companies might be on the agenda, and we've got to look at transnational linkages potentially. And so it is fascinating, I think, to work in this field. For me, WhatsApp has been fascinating to look at the way in which WhatsApp has been crucial to an election campaign in the past few years. As John said, Instagram is growing, and I think we're going to see more in the Instagram space, and you know, perhaps even in platforms like TikTok and how that might be used. So someone was asking about AI or deep fakes or these kind of things. We haven't seen too much of that, and we actually haven't seen too much of international or you know, foreign bad actors in Southeast Asia. A lot of that is overplayed from what we think in our research, and hyped up a little bit because it's driven by agendas from the West of, you know, Russia and disinformation. But in Southeast Asia, it is really often about local digital savvy companies and actors who know their local context and languages, and know the local agendas that they can drive, and the issues that will engage voters and enrage voters. So foreign actors are sometimes overplayed.
Yeah, and just to add on the issue of foreign interference, and this is also the case in Singapore and Thailand, where foreign interference is and the threats and moral panics around them were justified by the government to increase their purview of the information ecosystem. But at the same time, in the last election in the Philippines, what happened there was, it wasn't about like a foreign set of agents or a foreign fake news factory producing content in one context for the Philippine case, but it was actually money that was flowing. So mainland Chinese business tycoons making particular deals with local strategists. And so the money happened, and that transaction happens at that level, often not always with the full knowledge and full consent of the politician, so that there's a kind of arm's length that happens. So there's a deniability that's also enabled here, but here's a potential tycoon. He sees these politicians as actually quite sympathetic, or there's an alignment between corporate interests and him potentially winning. So we need transparency around that kind of arrangement. And I'm not sure what kinds of incentives are there for political consultants to be declaring those under the table kinds of arrangements, right? In terms of innovations, I want to think about how the largest broadcast network in the Philippines was just recently shut down, and that's 11,000 workers that have that whose jobs are under threat right in the middle of the pandemic, and over like a personal spat between Duterte and this company. So in the absence of mainstream media, what becomes a key influential figure in shaping political discourse will be influencers. And these could be vloggers, YouTube vloggers. So YouTube has, we documented, if you look at our report in the 2019 elections, we list so many pro-Duterte partisan news pages on YouTube. And we expect to see more YouTube celebrities and vloggers to giving like their hot takes on politics. And of course, they'll be taking money from politicians, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh boy, so much to chew on. I just want to point out to everyone in the chat column, Ross has been giving links to some useful, first the report, first and most importantly, and then a recent piece that Ross did about Malaysia, and then another one, I'm not sure what that's about, but
I'm just
we
shamelessly
encourage you.
sharing some previous stuff that answered some of these questions. So I hope
Okay,
people don't
great.
mind.
But yeah, but everybody's welcome to pay attention to them. What it seems to me, for those of you who are on this call, is this has underscored how urgent a problem disinformation is, but how elusive solutions are. And while Jonathan and Ross are worth following to give us some insights on directions forward, I think it is actually incumbent on all of us to think about these issues, because we're all part of this digital world now, and we have got to figure out a way to separate the bad actors from the good actors. But I hate to use that good bad, but figure out a way to incentivize information and not disinformation. So I hope you guys will do this again when we have a little bit more of a sense, and particularly whether this Facebook, I don't have much hopes for it, but anyway, this Facebook board comes into existence. And thank you everyone for joining. I'm sorry if I didn't get to all of your questions. I tried to bundle them, but I'm not an expert at bundling. And I just want to thank Ross and Jonathan. And I also want to thank our coordinator, Sheerness, for putting this together and helping us do this. Good night, everyone.